Hey everyone. So I'm going to be covering off CVE-2022 for let me get the right number. 42889. This is the Apache Commons text vulnerability. I did run the stream last night. I had technical issues, so I'm hoping tonight I won't. I made some changes, so fingers crossed does work. Basically, long story short, I'm running NVIDIA broadcast, which is awesome. It drowns out a lot of sound, especially from the mic. So it makes your voice really crystal clear. But obviously, it doesn't help when you can't hear anything. So I had some issues or settings in my VM that I tweaked. So maybe that'll have an impact. I'm also trying to avoid the background music. There's a plugin for Streamlabs, so maybe that's causing it. I don't know. So we'll see how it goes. But anyway, so yeah, this is kind of take two. Hopefully it'll work. Yeah, so covering this vulnerability. Now, there's been a lot of, I don't want to say confusion, but there's been a lot of sort of worry that this may have been along the lines of Log4j. And I'm making it absolutely clear it's not. There's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, Log4j is used extensively within the Java ecosystem. Like, it was the de facto logging library. It's changing. There are libraries such as like Logback and that now that are replacing or being used in place of Log4j. But a few years ago, if you logged something in Java, you pretty much used Log4j. So that meant it's extensively used, widespread use across the whole ecosystem. So you're talking about organizations and their own code, but also any third-party products that you may be using that are Java-based. So that's why that had such a significant impact and still does to this day. The other thing is, yes, there were some sort of caveats, but there weren't that much. Basically, if you're running the vulnerable version, you're kind of vulnerable. And given the widespread use of that library, it meant that the exposure of that was quite significant. With this, though, things are a bit different. So firstly, Apache Commons text is not as widespread as Log4j. In fact, I've never come across this library before this vulnerability, in fact. It may have been used, I just wasn't ever aware of it. So there's that. So the actual widespread scope of it is nowhere near, or I suspect nowhere as near as Log4j. And the other really, really important thing to call out is it just because you're using this library doesn't necessarily make you vulnerable. There are some things in place that you need to do in order to make it vulnerable. And that is using interpolation. And interpolation is not something enabled by default. It's something that you have to explicitly use. And when I went to go look at GitHub, there's basically two functions that you call that could result in you using interpolation. And when I went to go look at GitHub, I saw a grand total of 200 instances or lines of code using that. And out of that code, some of them were test classes, some of them were like forks of the Apache Commons library. So at most, there's way less than 200 instances in GitHub using this interpolation that may or may not be vulnerable. I don't know what version they were using. So that just shows you the scope of this vulnerability is very, very narrow. And then on top of all that, the inputs into this function needs to be unsanitized and user provided. So you're talking about the impact being pretty significant, but the likelihood very, very, very low. So that means the risk is fairly low and nothing to really worry about. Certainly not on the lines of Log4j. So there has been some concern that, yeah, maybe Log4j. I think it's maybe because of the way the exploit works and the functionality works. It is similar, but it's not by no means anywhere near Log4j. So just making that absolutely clear before we start. I did have a lot of fun actually reviewing this and trying to look into this vulnerability. In fact, one of the things I liked about it is because the library is pretty lightweight, it made it really easy to figure out what was going on and understand the vulnerability. With things like Log4j and that, they've been around for years, they've grown, and they can kind of become really complex. So it makes it difficult to understand the vulnerability. In this case, it's very simplistic in nature, in essence. So what is Apache Commons text? So if you come to their kind of landing homepage, gives you a bit of details about the library, but basically it's a library for performing functions on text. And the best area to come is to user guide, and they have these different functions. So there's things like you can do string escape utils, string substitutor. This is kind of where the vulnerability lies. So with this, you can provide like placeholders, and it will either execute those or replace those placeholders. So in this case, it will like look for the Java version, put it in this placeholder, and look for the OS name, getting these from system properties and putting that in place. This is where the vulnerability lies, because you have a string substitution using interpolation, and that's where the vulnerability is injected. And I'll show you in a bit where that is. But there are other things like you can do, I don't know, similarity and diffs and that kind of stuff. As I said, I've not really come across this library before all of this, so I've never really used it. Some of these functions, I don't know why you would use this library over something like string utils or something like that, or just the standard Java string things. So, for example, you can use string.substitute, but there must be use cases. Some people have gone through all the length of keeping this library and maintaining it. So, really, the crux is this text lookup, which is the interpolation, and what this is like. You can define a function within a text, and then that function will perform an action on the following kind of text that you provide over that key to that function. So in this case, like base64 decode, and then decode this text, or base64 encode and encode this text. And when you do the string substitutor, it will then place the result of this in place of whatever you call in here. So that's the basic premise of this function, and that's all well and good. I'll come to it in the end. This I would recommend against using. There are some really risky things associated with this, even outside of the vulnerability. It's not something that I would ever think about using unless you provide some really suitable caveats around that. And I'll go into that in a bit later. So what is the actual vulnerability? Well, the vulnerability is in this function. It's not actually about being able to call these, but there are some default lookups that you can do, which is on this page here. Actually, sorry, I opened the wrong page there. It's the string lookup factory. So these are the default lookups. So these are the ones that come out of the box when you start calling the interpolation lookups. So there they are there. There are 3 other lookups that aren't enabled by default. So you have to explicitly add them. And that is DNS, URL, and script. Now, these are deemed a bit risky. And there are other functions in the default which I'd also deem risky, so I don't know why they're enabled by default. But the key is these aren't enabled by default. So if you're using this interpolation, you would then assume like, okay, if someone provides script, they wouldn't be able to actually execute that JavaScript. Well, that turned out to not be the case. Due to some logic flaw when it was passing the lookups, you could actually pass these and it would actually execute them. So in other words, although the documentation says they're not enabled by default, they were indirectly enabled by default. So this means that you're under the assumption that you can run script, but in fact it could. Again, stressing not widespread. In fact, I've never come across this ever in terms of use in all my years looking at code in that. So that shows you how common this is. Maybe I've just been very lucky and secluded, but I've certainly not seen this in the past. So that's the key of the vulnerability itself. And what I've gone and done is created this proof of concept that you can then use and run, use to your heart's content. So it is available on this GitHub repository. So you can download it, play with it, do whatever you want with it. And the key here is the string substituted or create interpolator. So what this does is this sets up the interpolation kind of feature and it enables it with the defaults, but the vulnerability is it actually includes those other three when it shouldn't. There is another function. So if you are looking at code and trying to do regex to see if you're vulnerable, you want to look up create interpolator. I've seen some people mention, oh, just look at string substituter. That's not the case. String substituter on its own, there are other functions or methods in that aren't vulnerable to this. It has to be this create interpolator in order for the string substituter object to become vulnerable. Or if you use a string factory, lookup factory, there's a method in here called, trying to find it here, the interpolator string lookup. So if you create this instance, then again, you can then become vulnerable. So there's kind of two ways that you can be vulnerable, or two ways enable interpolation and then become vulnerable. So if you are looking for code, just look for these two methods. And if you identify them, you're potentially vulnerable. Again, not necessarily so. The input provided to it needs to be user controlled. If you aren't using these but still using the vulnerable library, you're likely not going to be vulnerable. And I'll show you in a bit why. So, as I said, in this proof of concept, this creates the vulnerability. And then we read an input string, and then we do this dot replace. So this actually now executes that interpolation process and actually runs the function or whatever. As I said, with the vulnerable versions, it shouldn't be able to execute DNS, script, and URL. Now, what are those things? So DNS allows you to do DNS lookups, both look up a host name as well as do things like reverse lookups on the IP address. And why is this a issue? Well, if you a attacker from the outside, you can't do this to internal services. So you can't do DNS lookups on internal servers. So you may struggle with, I don't know, trying to hit some box or something, and you need the IP address. Because this is actually run on the box, you can now have the ability to provide this input, so on a web page, on some application, and then it'll actually execute it for you on that box. So that box most probably will have access to the internal DNS servers. And that way you can make internal private DNS lookups. URL is a similar thing. You probably can't hit internal servers. And remember, this is a URL, so it's not just going to be defined to things like HTTP and HTTPS. It could be other things, maybe like FTP or something like that. Don't know how many companies are running internal FTP servers, but yeah. But the point, again, is you can use this to then call and hit internal servers. So this will just be like a simple get. You can't do things like post as far as I'm aware, but you can certainly do things like get. And then by far the most dangerous one is the script. In fact, this came as a bit of a surprise to me when I first looked at this. I was like, JavaScript, it's Java. There's no JavaScript in Java. Don't worry about it, it's fine. And then I realized that actually there's a JavaScript engine within the JVM. I don't know why you would want to ever do that. There must be use cases again. It just screams like a bad idea. But anyway, JavaScript does have a engine then. JDK versions prior to 15 have the Nashorn engine. So then you can just call it with script JavaScript. Now, there was some confusion around this because JDK 15 and later no longer include the Nashorn engine. So I thought, okay, great, no JavaScript engine, safe. That's actually not the case. There's a Zexel, Z-E-X-L. Again, on my page here, I've got the details. So if you're using JDK 15 later, it is still potentially vulnerable because there's a Zexel engine and you can still potentially execute JavaScript. So I've been waffling on all about the proof of concept and that, but let's actually see it in action. So hopefully I can run this now. So if we run this, what this is going to do is run this, and my proof of concept just allows you to enter text, free text, and I'll just read it in from the command line. If you don't enter in anything, it's just going to use this default. So if we actually just run it without any input, you can see that it's triggering the JavaScript engine, the Nashorn engine, and then it's actually executing that JavaScript. So you're saying this is a script, the engine's Nashorn, and then the JavaScript to call. So in this case, it's executing 195 plus 324, adding those two, and the result is 519. Now, that's great, but what if we want to do something maybe a bit better? So if we run this again, and we can start doing things like script, JavaScript. What's it? It's java.lang.runtime.get runtime.exec. I'm just trying to think of something. So the problem with this script is it's blind. So you'll see why it doesn't actually return. The exec doesn't actually return any text other than the process. Let's make a directory so you can actually see it here. POC test. So if this works, we should see a directory appear within this here called POC test. So that runs. Did I not do that? Get method. Maybe I know what I did wrong. I used single quotes instead of double quotes. I've been using Python too much lately. You can switch between the both. So if we just make this double quotes, make dr POC test. Okay, so if we run this, what is going on? I don't know what's going on. Maybe I've got my wrong. Java.lang.runtime.get runtime exec. Make the that's so weird. Maybe there's something else. But you can see it is actually executing the or starting up the engine. Maybe I am being silly and doing something that I shouldn't do. I think I got my syntax wrong. I think I have an example, better one, I'll just copy that. I think I got my command wrong there. There we go. That's better. I must have got something wrong in my command. So there we go. You can see it's now created this directory. And as I said, it's kind of blind because all you get back is this process ID. But this is okay. So what you could do is use this to create a bound shell, and then you can get like now cat on your other system and connect to it and target it that way, or use this to connect out to a reverse shell on your end. So, and then that way you can get a shell to the system. And then, of course, like try to do other things. Now, that is the script. Other things you can do, as I said, the slightly less dangerous ones is like DNS. So you can look up a DNS. So name, I think, is it address? It's kind of a weird format. So you got to use address and then pop and then the host name. .co.uk. And as I said, this would mean you can then do DNS lookups. So there's been a comment: is a full system admin or in the context that it's running as? So this will be whatever user the server is running as, and this is kind of why you don't run servers as root, because if there's any remote code execution in that server code, you're going to get it root access. So ideally, you would have a specific user that's created for running a web server, and then when you execute this, you only have context as that user. Yeah, in a perfect world. That's not always the case, unfortunately. But it's also important to note, and kind of this is where I'm going elsewhere, why this is a really dangerous feature, is you could then use that functionality to gain shell, and then with that shell, you can get like things like configuration, which will probably contain like database configuration. And because you're on that server, and that server talks to the database, guess what? You can then connect to the database and do things that way. So it's still pretty bad. Depending on the service, gaining root may or may not even give you much of an advantage because everything's in context of that web app. But it's going to be very context aware in terms of that case. So that's a DNS. So you can actually do a reverse lookup on the DNS. So if we just copy this IP address here, oh no, copy it, and so DNS, and then we want to do name. So look up the name. There's IP address. Paste that. So that will do a lookup on the IP address. Because it's load balance and all that, it's going to turn up this, but you kind of get the idea. And then you can also do like canonical name. I couldn't pronounce it. And then the final one that I want to show you is the URL. So this is where you can actually call, basically do GET requests. So you got to define the character set. So in this case, UTF-8, and then let's call Google. So www.google.com, and yeah. So it won't do the full requests response. So like headers and that, it will return the body. So in this case, you can see the full HTML page. So yeah, that's the vulnerability itself. So if we come in, the official fix is out. It's 1.10.0. The vulnerability is from versions 1.5 up to, not including 10.0. So if we save this, and we will now need to, I'm just going to recompile it just in case. Okay. So if we now run this, I'll just run it here. Run it. Okay, and let's take this run here rather than the standard string, and paste this in. Because this is not enabled by default and it's doing the correct logic now, it's not going to actually execute it. And just to show you that it is still doing interpolation, we can do things like, okay, let's do this. Hello world. All right, base 64. There we go. So you can actually see it is still doing interpolation. Now, that's good. So yeah, we're good. Just see in the comment, yeah, SQL may have command. Yeah, SQL, if you get to the SQL server, depending on how the SQL server is configured, again, should be running in the perfect world, again, perfect world, as a non-root user. But yeah, you can potentially get command access as well. Again, shouldn't be enabled on a SQL server, especially like a MySQL server. But as we all know, that's not always the case. So that's the vulnerability itself. Now, there's a bit more to this because I saw that as like, okay, great, but there's some other glaring things that I just stood out and jumped out to me and screamed to me. Like, these are things that I don't understand. Why are we worrying about only these three lookups when there's all this other stuff? So coming back to the default lookups. So yes, there's URL, yes, there's DNS, and there's scripts. Script would definitely being the more dangerous one, but I think there's other more dangerous ones than. But if we take script out of it, I think there are more dangerous ones in this list here that are enabled by default. So, for example, one is env, right? So if I do export, I don't know, my super secret and password 123. Pretty benign. So if we now echo that, it should be set. My super secret. There we go. All right. So that's now set, and we can use this env lookup to actually fetch this. All right. So if we run this now, we can do this interpolation with env. I think it's just like this, env, and then the environment variable that you want to look up, and there we go. And the reason why this is a problem is more and more systems and services, like even things like Docker, are now partying secrets as environment variables. Especially if you're talking things like Kubernetes and that world, this is used quite a bit. So you now suddenly have a situation where if you have any of these user inputs, you can call these env. Obviously, you need to know the env variable or to call, but you can get them. So this is really, really dangerous to me. And some of these, like if I know it's Docker, then there are some defined kind of Docker secrets and process kind of configuration and conventions that you would use to set up things like authentication to a Docker repository. So this is incredibly dangerous, and it's enabled by default. Other things are like this const. So I'll come back to that at the end because I want to show you one more thing with regards to the vulnerability. But there's also file. So you can actually return the contents of a file. And to me, that just screams like danger. So if we go file, and then you provide the character set, so in this case, UTF-8, and then what file you want, it will happily give you that file as long as it has permissions to that file. And there we go, the password file. And this is enabled by default. So you could use this to start reading configuration files of the server. And from that, you can get things like secrets and all of that kind of stuff. It just, yeah, I don't understand why those are enabled. You can also do things like properties. So if you're using Java, which is very common in Java, is Java properties. So you can use this to look up properties. Resource bundle is like resources within like, what do you call it? Web servers and that kind of stuff, and jar files. So these are potentially dangerous, and I don't know why you would have these enabled by default. So if you are going to do these, what I would recommend is not use a default list. Try formulate your own list and only have the ones that you need, or the ones that are okay. So like URL decoder and encoder. Even XML is probably vulnerable to what's the vulnerability around XML? I'm drawing a blank. The XML parsing vulnerabilities. I forgot this term. My brain's going dead. It's Friday. But then also like base64 is okay. But yeah, there's some really dangerous ones like file. It's just baffles me why those are enabled by default. So that is the dangerous part of using this feature. So my advice is I would actually avoid it completely. Rather be safe than sorry. But if you do have to use it, make sure the user input is sanitized. Maybe use things like allow lists, so you can prevent the functions that you don't want, or even better, build up a better defined list of or lookup map that only contains things that are not going to be dangerous. One more thing I just wanted to touch on before I end this is, so I'm just going to re-enable the vulnerability per se. Is this here? So one of the lookups is this const. So you can actually look up a constant, Java constant. Now, if we run this again, and this is why solely relying on regex and that to try to attack these. So like looking for regex with script colon and that kind of stuff in your inputs is not the way to go. So if we open this now again, and we want to get this, so we can look up const of this. So if we do const, so you just provide the package class and then the constant that you want to look up. You'll see something pretty interesting here. You would expect dollar script blah blah blah, but that's not what actually happens. Actually, sorry, it's not what. What should have happened? Why is that? Did I run? That's weird. Const. Wow. Okay. It's not executing. That's right. Const. Just got to see I got the right. Wow. Why is that not working? The point is, what it will do is it will actually recursively interpolate. So it will then call the const, substitute the const, and then see this is in there and actually execute the script. I don't know why it's not working. Did I use const? Yeah, C-I-N-S-T, C-N-A-S-T. Why is that not working? Oh, I know why. I didn't have the right capitalization. Now it should work. So if we run that, there we go. So there you can see it execute in the Nashorn engine, and there's the result of the JavaScript executing, and that's because it does recursive. So that's why you shouldn't rely on like regex in your input, because you can still then potentially have these types of things. So yeah, that's it, really, in a nutshell. So in terms of this proof of concept, there's a the code there. So if you want to just use Java and Maven to do it, that's fine. You can do that, or you can also use Docker. So I've done a little Docker bit. So you just do Docker build -t park dot. So -t is just tagging it. You can call it whatever you want. I'll just I'm not very imaginative with names, and then just Docker run -t, so whatever you named it, and then that will. Oh, sorry, don't want to do that. I will do this. Darn it. I'll need to come to another terminal. I'll always do this. You don't want to do Docker, just Docker -t. You want to do Docker run -rt, and then it's the R means interactive, so you can actually use input your string or just hit enter. If you don't do that, then it will like hang because it's not interactive and it's waiting for inputs. So in this case, you can just run it and it'll run there, or input your string. So that's if you don't know like Java or don't want to install Maven and all that. That's there via Docker. So yeah, again, really interesting vulnerability, very worrisome feature, but Thankfully, like it's not widely used, so very limited in terms of exposure. So definitely not on things like Log4j. I had loads of fun looking at it and investigating it. If you are interested in this stuff, I would recommend this because, as I said, beginning, it's pretty lightweight library, so it's very easy to figure out what's going on and look at the code and work things out. And that kind of made it a lot easier and more exciting than try to work through deluge of lines and lines of code. There's only like 3 or 4 classes that you need to really pay attention to. So yeah, hopefully this has been useful. Seems that everything's worked fine tonight, so fingers crossed. I've found the issue, and yeah, I will be streaming again next week. I'll try to pick things up again on Thursday. I don't know what I'm going to be covering. I'll think of something. If you do think of something you want me to cover it, please give me a shout. I'd love to try. I can't promise. It may be something I know nothing about or have the skills. But if you do think of something, let me know. I'll be more than happy to try at least look into it. If not, I'll try to think of something and hopefully be back on Thursday, around about 9 o'clock UK time. So hopefully this has been useful for you and interesting and gives you insight into the vulnerability. As I said, again, I certainly had loads of fun looking into it and playing around and creating the proof of concept. And yeah, have fun. It's all there. Have fun. And yeah, catch you on the next one. Bye.
Swear I won't forget this, why do I regret this? In my mind reckless, thoughts are feeling endless. Sitting up, I'm breathless, anxiety's infectious. I feel so defenseless, betrayed and embarrassed. I hate being open, I hate being broken. I feel like an ocean filled up with emotion. Anger ain't a potion, rub it on like lotion. I can feel it soaking, reopen, the scars have awoken. I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. Cause I can't move on till I let go. I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. Cause I can't move on till I let go.